Assalamu alaikum. So, we were studying about the lymphatic system, and in the last lecture we studied some introduction of the lymph nodes, so now we're going to elaborate into some detail of the structure of the lymph node. No, now it's imperative that you understand the structure because this picture is going to come again and again, and you need to understand this thing. So, let's review a bit. There were central lymphoid tissue and peripheral lymphoid tissue. Central lymphoid tissue included thymus and the bone marrow. Okay, so central lymphoid organs included the thymus and the bone marrow, whereas the peripheral lymphoid organs included spleen, lymph nodes, and all these structures, etc. So we're going to go into the detail of the spleen. Lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are small checkpoints that are present on the lymphatic vessels. So minute lymphatic vessels would originate from the intercellular spaces, and they would then combine together to form larger vessels. These vessels would then have to pass through these checkpoints, which are the lymph nodes, which are small nodules of lymphoid tissue that are found in the course of small lymphatics. Now, all the lymph channels, lymph vessels, would have to pass through one or more lymph nodes during their course of travel from intercellular space towards the major thoracic duct or the lymphatic ducts. So the nodules are oval or kidney shaped, which are 1 to 25 millimeters long, and they occur in groups or as single structures. Then there are superficial nodes and deep nodes. Superficial nodes are present along the veins, and deep nodes are present along the arteries. Okay, so till this point we've studied. Now we will study more detail of lymph node. So each lymph node has a slight depression on one side that is known as the hilum. As we can see, it is kidney or bean shaped with hilum on one side, same as that of the kidney. Hilum is the structure, is the part from where the major vessels would enter or exit a tissue or a structure. So in case of lymph nodes, the major artery of the lymph node would enter through the hilum, and the vein would exit through the hilum along with the efferent lymph vessel. So the entry and exit point of the blood and exit point of the lymph is the hilum. Now what about the entry point of the lymph? So the efferent lymph vessels, they would enter the lymph node through the periphery. So as we can see, they enter through the periphery. Alright, so they would enter at different points, different parts of its periphery. And the lymph node is made up of following parts. Now let's get into detail of these parts. A fibrous or reticular framework. So framework is a broad term that is used to explain any structural components that give the organ its shape and structure. So the main structure of the lymph node, the shape of the lymph node, is maintained by this fibrous and reticular framework. Then there are small lymphatic channels, some channels which are entering or afferent channels, A for ana, afferent, and then efferent channels which are exiting the lymph node. Then there is the outer cortex of the lymph node and then inner medulla of the lymph node. And there are blood channels which are next to the blood vessels. Okay, so through the blood channels, the arterial blood and the venous blood, arterial blood enters through the hilum, then it is distributed towards smaller blood channels where it is used up deoxygenated blood through the veins. Venules would then combine together to form veins and then come out. So there are blood channels which are present there. So now we'll look at the structures one by one. So outermost would be the fibrous capsule or the fibrous framework, fibrous and reticular framework. Then would come the cortex and then the medulla in the center. So now we'll look at the structures that are present in the lymph node one by one. The fibrous and the reticular framework of the lymph node gives it its shape, keeps its structure intact and at a certain position in the body. The lymph node is covered by a capsule that is made up of collagen fibers mainly, and then there are few elastin fibers. Collagen is the main component that is present in all muscles, that is present in all bones. So all of the structural integrity of these tissues are maintained by these collagenous fibers. Same is the case of lymph node. They form a capsule which would maintain the size and shape of lymph node. And from the capsule, a number of trabeculae would extend into the interior of the node where they are continuous with the reticular fibers. Trabeculae are basically finger-like projections. So if we look at the lymph nodes picture, these are the trabeculae which are extending into the cortex through the capsule. Alright, so this greenish colored outer structure is the capsule, and then these finger-like projections going inside are the trabeculae. Alright, these are trabeculae. Remember, trabeculae are finger-like projections. In this picture, these are the trabeculae. This is the trabeculae. This is the outer capsule. Alright, let's talk about the lymphatic channels. The subcapsular sinus lies beneath the capsule and surrounds the node except at the hilum. So this is the subcapsular sinus, this large blood vessel that surrounds the whole lymph node except here at the hilum. This larger vessel is known as the subcapsular sinus. Sinus is a drainage site where blood or any other fluid can be collected. Subcapsular means it's immediately below the capsule. So this is the subcapsular sinus. The afferent lymphatics of the node would open into the subcapsular sinus, which would then give rise to many cortical sinuses. Subcapsular sinus was present just below the capsule of the lymph node, whereas cortical sinuses would be those sinuses which would penetrate deep into the cortex, running towards the medulla, where they would unite with each other to form the larger medullary sinuses, which would join together to form the efferent lymphatics draining the lymph node. So now let's look at the structures. So these are the efferent lymphatic vessels which empty out into this subcapsular sinus. This is the subcapsular sinus. From the subcapsular sinus, cortical sinuses would originate. These are cortical sinuses which are surrounding the trabeculae. So these cortical sinuses would go inwards toward the medulla, where they combine together to form the medullary sinuses. These medullary sinuses would then combine to form a efferent lymphatic vessel. Alright, so these cortical sinuses are smaller in size and they would combine together to form larger sinuses, medullary sinuses, which would then combine together to form a efferent lymph vessel. So the lymph fluid would enter through here, the afferent lymph node, afferent lymph vessel into the lymph node, would go into the subcapsular sinus, then into the cortical sinus, then into the medullary sinus, then would leave through the efferent lymph vessel. Okay, so these were the lymphatic channels which were component of lymph node. Now let's talk about the cortex. Cortex is the outer part of the lymph node which is made up of lymphatic follicles and is traversed by fibrous trabeculae. So this part is the cortex. This whole of this part is cortex, that is present below the subcapsular sinus and above the medulla. So this is the cortex. Cortex contains cortical nodules as well as it contains the trabeculae, which are finger-like projections which are present here. So cortex is traversed by, that is crossed by, fibrous trabeculae, and this cortex is much more cellular as compared to medulla. So the cell component of the cortex is higher than the medulla. There are many cells which are present here. Basically, the cortex can be divided into two parts, an outer part and an inner part. This is the outer part of the cortex, and near the medulla this is the inner part of the cortex. You can look at this picture. Cells are abundant here in the outer part and are in less number in the inner part. So the outer part would contain immature B lymphocytes and macrophages. So macrophages, which would engulf larger protein particles or bacteria or byproducts of the broken down cells, are present here in the outer part along with immature B lymphocytes. Now these B lymphocytes, when travel towards the inner part, they would become mature. Mature B lymphocytes would occur here. So in the inner part, between the germinal center and the medulla, this part would contain T lymphocyte. B lymphocyte, immature B lymphocyte is present here in the outer part, and T lymphocytes are present here in the inner part. This inner part is also known as thymus dependent part because T lymphocytes are matured in the thymus and then they are transported here in the inner part of the lymph node cortex. So this part is also known as the paracortex or the thymus dependent zone. So by now I think you get the concept. This is the outer part, this is the inner part. B lymphocytes here and T lymphocytes here. Now let's look at the medulla, that is this inner blackish part of the lymph node. Medulla is the central part of the lymph node and it is less cellular than the cortex. This medulla has lymphocytes, plasma cells, and macrophages. Alright. So cortex contains the T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, whereas medulla contains the both of the lymphocytes, plasma cells, and macrophages. Now let's talk about the blood channels. So the blood channels are formed like this. An artery enters the lymph node through the hilum, and it would divide into straight branches which would run in the trabeculae. So this artery is entering through the hilum and giving out straight branches for each trabeculae. Alright, so they run between the trabeculae, these arteries, where they would divide and subdivide into arterioles and then into capillaries. These arterioles and capillaries would form anastomosis with each other, as well as would form bunches with anastomosing parts with venules. So they would form anastomotic loops, and the nutrients and oxygen and the things needed by the cortical cells are extracted from here, and they would then transform into the veins, which would then go back, combine together in the form of a single vein, and then exit through the hilum. So these arteries and veins would be present throughout the trabeculae. Alright, and these lymphatic channels would also be present throughout the trabeculae. Now let's talk about some functions of the lymph node. So the lymph capillaries, these smaller channels, they absorb and remove the large protein molecules and other particulate matter from the tissue spaces. Particulate matter means the blood normally should compose of plasma as well as the blood cells and some nutrients. There should not be larger proteins circulating in the blood, or large particles such as bacterial particles or viruses should not be present within the blood. Now what happens is, whenever these particles enter these small lymphatic channels, they are grabbed onto by macrophages that are present in the lymph node. Same thing happens in the spleen, and it would be removed from the capillaries. Moreover, the lymphatics, which are known as lacteals, they also help in transportation of fat from the gut. So the blood vessels of the gut, which are just absorb the fat when they travel towards lymph node and they enter the lymph node. The fat is also extracted from this blood into the lymph node and then transported through the lymph vessels towards its target site, that is the liver. Now what are the functions of a lymph node? Let's look at that. So the lymph node would act as filter of the lymph. Lymph enters through here, goes into smaller channels, divide and redivide, and then recombine and then exit. So lymph node is just like a filter of the lymph fluid. Moreover, foreign particles would be engulfed by macrophages that are present here in the sinuses. So there are many macrophages which occur here as well as in the medulla, and uh, they would engulf foreign particles which are present in the lymph and is traveling through this cortical and paracortical sinuses, medullary sinuses. Moreover, the mature B and T lymphocytes are produced in the node. T lymphocytes will mature in the thymus, B lymphocytes will mature in the bone marrow, but they are produced in the lymph nodes. And both the humoral and the cellular immune response occurs through lymph nodes. Humoral response is when there are antibodies that are present in our blood and a foreign particle comes, let's suppose a bacteria comes, these antibodies would attach with the with the bacteria and try to destroy that. So they are just like bullets fired by army person or bombs that are being thrown by the army on the enemy. So these bullets or these bombs, they are circulating in our blood, and whenever an enemy comes, they would come in contact with that and detonate to destroy the enemy. On the other hand, cellular immune responses, when our cells are particularly engaged in destroying that particle. So it is just like arresting a criminal. So your cell have to be there, have to grab that bacteria or the foreign particle, have to engulf that and then try to break it. So that is cell mediated immunity, whereas humoral immunity is when there are antibodies that are already present there. So both kind of immunities would occur in the lymph node. Now let's look at some diseases of the lymph nodes. So there is lymphangitis and lymphadenitis. Inflammation of the lymphatic channels is known as lymphangitis, whereas inflammation of the lymph nodes is known as lymphadenitis. So the clinical correlation of this condition would be painful red lines leading to the painful and tender swollen lymph nodes would be seen on the skin. So the lymphatic channel, if there is lymphangitis, the lymphatic channel that is carrying the lymph and is inflamed would look as a painful red line that would end up in the lymph node. And if there is lymphadenitis too, that lymph node would also be swollen. It would be tender to touch. That is, if we touch or try to feel that lymph node, it would be enlarged in size and it would hurt a lot. Such happens in tonsillitis. Tonsils are inflamed, we can clearly look at those, and they are tender to touch. The patient is unable to eat. The patient is unable to swallow even the saliva because it hurts when it touches the tonsils. And this lymphadenitis can be of two types, acute or chronic. Acute is new infection. Chronic is when the infection has been present for more than 4 to 6 weeks. Then there is a disease which is known as elephantiasis. In elephantiasis, there is a parasite that is a filarial parasite, filaria, that starts living in the lymphatics, and it divides, increases its population in the lymphatics, hence by blocking the lymphatic channels. So when lymphatic channels they get blocked, more and more lymph would start accumulating in the organ from where the lymphatic channels were draining the fluid. So if the lymphatic channels of the popliteal region, that is the knee region, are blocked, there would be excessive lymph that would accumulate in the lower legs and solid edema would occur. The organ would get huge in size, and in the area of the peripheral area of the drainage there would be solid edema. Solid edema is, it would be solid to touch. It would not feel like as if some fluid is accumulated there. It would feel like as it is tissue inflammation. The lower limbs are massively swollen and the skin is thickened in this condition, in this elephantiasis. So lower limbs, scrotal region or the upper limbs, mostly lower limbs are involved, and now you have to look at a picture of elephantiasis and let me know in the group how did you feel. Okay, so the skin gets thickened, solid edema occurs, there is enlargement in size of the organ. The lymphatics provide the most convenient route of spread of cancer cells. We must remember that. Whenever there is cancer, let's suppose there is cancer in the breast, these cancerous cells can most conveniently, most easily seed through the lymphatic vessels into the axillary lymph node or into the mesenteric lymph nodes and affect the other parts such as the intestine or the kidneys or the liver or the arms or any other part. So the lymphatic channels are a very common, are a very convenient route of spread for the cancer cells. Whenever there is cancer of any particular part of the body, the lymphatic vessels that are draining that particular part, the lymphatic lymph nodes, are always checked to check for the metastasis of the cancer if it has spread or not. To answer this question, we check the lymph nodes of that region, and if there are cancerous cells that are present in the lymph and they are being transported to the other organs, the lymph nodes draining that region would become fixed. Normally they are mobile. They would become fixed and they would become solid like stones, stony hard. So in cancer, this thing happens. This is how the lymph nodes would look like. Okay, bache, so this marks the end of the lymphatic system for us. So I hope all of you understood well. If you have any questions, please post it in the group. I'll be happy to answer your questions. It is a very important system, often misunderstood. Often people just ignore the system, but we must know about the tissue histology and the structure of the lymph node and the name of the lymphatics, etc., of different organs, of different parts, if you want to become good doctors. So see you in the next lecture tomorrow, inshallah. Take care. Allah Hafiz.